welcome to Yoga Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Waycott. In today's episode, I'm talking about one of my favorite subjects to teach on, which is verbal cues and why your words matter as a yoga teacher. I'm going to talk about why this is a teaching skill that is sometimes overlooked, and I'm also going to give you a step-by-step process that you can implement today to audit your own verbal cues. I'm so excited to share this episode with you. Let's jump in. All right, we are back again for another episode. I just have to get comfy in my chair. It's nice to be here. I went to my workout class this morning. Something that I don't talk about a lot is that I like to make an effort to go participate in non-yoga related movement. And so I went and lifted some weights and it was really fun. And now we're here. So I'm excited for today's episode. I want to talk about one of my most favorite things to teach on, and that is how to refine your verbal cues and how to become a more effective communicator in the yoga classroom. I have always had a thing for language. When I was in undergraduate school and university, I studied English and professional communications. And it's really fun to bring that background into the work that I do today with yoga teachers. I teach an entire module in my 200-hour trainings on this, on how to create verbal cues that work and land and make sense. And I also run continuing education workshops on this. And I think that part of, effective communication is the ability to facilitate understanding and connection. And I always say to yoga teachers that your words are really your most powerful teaching tool. So in this episode, I'm going to share why your words matter, why this particular skill sometimes gets ignored or kind of pushed to the back burner. And then the most exciting part is that I'm actually going to give you a step-by-step process to basically audit your own verbal cues. And this is something that you can implement starting today. You don't have to have a mentor. You don't have to have a yoga community around you to be able to do this and start making refinements. So that's going to be the really juicy part. So make sure that you listen to the full episode so that you can get all of those tips. So the first question is, why does cueing matter? Why do our words matter? And whenever I teach on this, I love to start with a little bit of reflection. So I'll do that with you today. I want you to close your eyes and think back to a time when you were a student in a yoga class where the teacher's cues were just abundantly clear. So how did it feel to be in a class where you knew exactly what to do? You knew exactly where your teacher wanted you to go. And see if you can just connect to how that felt for you. Now, whenever I ask people to share about their experiences in these types of classes, a lot of times the words that come up for people are things like they felt connected, they felt present in their experience, they felt like they were able to really be in their bodies, in their experience. They could maybe even close their eyes for the class and they didn't have to look around to, see what was going on around them. And that just illustrates how powerful our words really are as teachers. And then the other thing that I always ask people to reflect on is to think back to a time where maybe you took a class where things just weren't exactly clear, right? Maybe your teacher was having an off day or whatever, and you felt confused. And just think about kind of what it was like to be in a class like that. And what I often hear people say that, when they're in those kinds of classes is that they end up kind of placing a little bit of blame on themselves, which I think is really interesting. So it's almost like if we as the student don't understand things right away, we automatically assume that we have some sort of incompetence or like inadequacy as a student. I just think that that's really interesting that a lot of people kind of come up with that similar reflection when they think about this. And then the other thing that people say is that, when the class is unclear, when the cues, don't quite land and don't quite make sense, is that they are pulled out of their experience because they're having to look around the room and look at other people and, try to figure out what they're supposed to be doing. So the truth is that our words have a massive impact on how things go in the classroom. They have an impact on our students' ability to understand and to learn. And I think what's really important to note is that good verbal cues really help our students feel empowered and confident. They know exactly what to do. They know exactly where to go. And that sense of clarity is another way that we build trust. And I'm always talking about that in trainings. Like, what are the ways that we establish trust with our students? Because that's so important in this type of relationship. And I think that, verbal cueing is a skill that gets ignored for a few different reasons. First of all, it is not sexy or flashy. So it's not something that you can necessarily see in like a picture or a video, for example. It doesn't get the same kind of attention as like big fancy poses or, really amazing creative sequencing that's like fun and interesting to look at. And so from a yoga industrial complex perspective, verbal cues don't sell the way that other things do. Yeah, so I think that that's kind of like the first piece there. And then I also think, just from a kind of like a training perspective, you'll know if you've ever written a curriculum for a YTT or if you've ever delivered a YTT, that there's a huge breadth of knowledge that needs to be covered in a 200-hour training. And there's not enough time to go super deep on like anything, to be quite honest with you. And I think in an initial training, there's room to learn about cueing, there's room to practice cueing, but so much of the real learning and refining happens once we actually go out into the world and begin teaching. And I think that for new teachers, there is an overwhelming amount of things to think about. We're really, really multitasking as teachers. And when we're new, we're trying to remember our sequence. We're trying to remember the timing of things. We are trying to manage the expectations in the room, the energy in the room. And then typically, especially when you're new, you're also trying to manage your own energy and your own nerves. And sometimes language becomes a little bit of an afterthought. I want to tell you a quick story about this from my own experience. So, when I was a brand new yoga teacher, I didn't really think a ton about verbal cues. The initial 200-hour training that I took many, many years ago was so comprehensive. It was incredible. It was with Dan Clement and Bernie Clark and tons of amazing guest teachers. But I don't recall having any particular lessons on like verbal cueing or how to create cues that make sense. And it doesn't mean that it wasn't there. I just don't recall having that lesson. And so once I went out and I started teaching after my first training, which was right away, I think that I was able to communicate pretty effectively, like how to get in and out of basic yoga poses and how to move through like familiar patterns of movement, like variations of sun salutations. And I think part of that was because I grew up with yoga and had spent so much time with yoga before I went into training. So there was like this, foundation of like familiarity with the practice that was there already. But whenever I would encounter what I would consider like a more intermediate or advanced posture that I wanted to teach, and what I mean by that is a pose with multiple elements of complexity and multiple details to speak to, I would resort to kind of like this really bad habit that I developed. And this was back in my earlier days of teaching. And I would get to the pose in class and I would say, all right, everyone, like stop what you're doing and take a look at me and I'm going to show you what we're going to do next. And I would demo the pose, but I wouldn't teach it. Like I would literally just do the pose in front of everyone. And then I would like turn to the class and be like, okay, like now you do it. Now it's your turn. And I would be met by these kind of like disappointed blank stares because I had just shown everybody how to do something really complicated, but I hadn't actually taught them how to do it. I hadn't given them any options. And, like it's funny when I look back on it now because obviously I would never do that. And like demos have a time and place. But what I realized was, thanks to some really incredible continuing education and thanks to practicing with some very competent, experienced teachers was that I needed to give more attention to my language and the way that I was using words and the way that I was forming cues. And what was helpful to also just, be aware of was that I didn't need to overcomplicate cueing. And I think that whenever I saw a big pose with lots of layers, I would kind of freeze up and get overwhelmed. And I would think to myself, like, okay, there's so many steps here and there's so much that I need to communicate. I'm just not even going to communicate it at all. And it was really helpful to learn, how to kind of strip back my language and speak to what is really, really necessary. And once I learned to do that, again, through, pursuing a lot of continuing education, there was a really noticeable difference in my teaching. I developed the confidence to teach any pose, and my students were really thankful for that. I started getting really great feedback from students saying, wow, like I like the way that you broke that down, or that's the first time somebody's actually really taught that to me. And I feel like refining my verbal cues was kind of like the missing piece that I needed at that time in my teaching to be able to kind of move into the next level. And so what I want to offer you today are some really simple tips. So some really simple steps that you can implement yourself to begin to audit your own verbal cues. And I want to acknowledge that not everybody has a mentor, not everybody has a teacher that they have access to, a yoga community around them. Maybe you live somewhere really rural and you're like the only teacher in your community. And this is essentially a way that you can begin to give yourself feedback and make improvements when it comes to your use of language as a yoga teacher. So the first step in this audit is to start recording yourself when you're teaching. So you could do this by setting up your phone or setting up a camera, and you could choose to record audio and video or just audio. But what's important is that you're able to hear yourself really well when you listen to it back. And of course, this recording is just going to be for your personal use. And if you haven't done this before, so if you don't have experience like teaching online or creating pre-recorded classes or anything like that, just know that this can feel really confronting and it can feel kind of awkward and like cringy to hear yourself teach and hear your own voice. But this is such an effective way to begin to catch some of those maybe like unconscious habits that you have when you're teaching that you might not even be aware of. So I would make a habit of, beginning to record yourself, and maybe it's just once a week or once a month. Like it doesn't have to be every single class, but sit down and listen to the recording. And when you do that, my recommendation is actually that you close your eyes and try to visualize the instructions that you're giving, because that's one of the ways that you'll be able to know quite quickly, like if they're making sense or not. And then just ask yourself, does this make sense? Is this clear? Are there moments in my teaching or my language or my words that really stand out to me, and start to make just kind of like general notes of what you're noticing throughout the class. And then that's going to bring us into the next step where we get a little bit more detailed. And this is where you can begin to audit for clarity. So when we talk about clarity, the goal is to create cues that are direct, that are actionable, that are easy to follow without adding unnecessary fluff. And as yoga teachers, we are often under time limitations when we're teaching. And a lot of classes these days are only 60 minutes long. And if you teach 60-minute classes, you know that that's not a lot of time to do all the things that you want to do and say all of the things that you want to say. So that means that everything that we say in a class needs to be really intentional. And sometimes to be really effective with our words, we need to be able to strip things back and learn to remove anything that is unnecessary, anything that absolutely doesn't need to be there, so that we can be as clear as possible. So when I teach on this, especially in 200-hour trainings, I love to use a formula and introduce a formula to my students. And I think it's really helpful to have something to start with like this in the beginning, just because when I was a new teacher, I didn't have a formula to begin with and I was kind of winging it. But what I like to use is the verb plus body part plus direction formula. It's super simple and effective. I did not make it up. As far as I'm aware, it's quite popular around the world, but I'll break it down for you just in case you haven't heard of it or you're not that familiar with it. So verb plus body part plus direction is what I would consider to be quite a universal formula for creating cues in the English language, at least, because you can use it to cue pretty much any pose, right? And obviously, there's always going to be a few exceptions, but generally speaking, it's going to give you pretty clear cues. So the first part of the formula is verb, and that's your action word. So when you're picking your verb in each sentence, you want to try to use the action word that best describes what you want your students to do. So what action is it? And can you get as precise as possible with that action? So this is the words like step, reach, hug, pull, extend, whatever it may be. And when you're using your verb, you want to speak in the present tense to imply immediacy. And I'll come back around to that in a moment and illustrate that a little bit more for you. Okay, so verb is your action word. What do you want your students to do? And are you speaking in the present tense? Okay, the next part of the formula is body part. So once you've stated the action, then you want to decide what part of the body is your student moving. And again, you want to get as specific as possible when you're talking about that part of the body. So what are you actually moving? Is it the hand? Is it the shoulder? Is it the foot? And then when you're speaking about the body, we also want to try to make it personal. So we want to say move your hand, move your foot, etc., just to, really let people embody that experience of moving their bodies. And the other thing when we are talking about body parts is we want to use everyday colloquial language that people can understand easily. Okay? The last part of the formula is direction. And this is what's going to describe where people are moving that part of their body. So this is typically where we choose an adverb to describe direction. And then sometimes it's in relationship to something like a particular place on the mat or a particular place in the room. So it might be something like reach your right hand towards the windows. Okay, just to give you an example. So another example is like step your right foot back. So we always want these cues to be really clear and direct and easy to follow. So when you are auditing for clarity, think about how you could use that formula for literally all of your sentences, all of your cues, all of your directions. And when you're listening back to your recording, some of the things that you're looking for, again, are you using the present tense or are you using passive language? Okay, especially when it comes to your verbs, to your action words. So one of the things that I see a lot of yoga teachers doing is speaking really passively. And I think that part of that might be, that we don't want to come across like too, I don't know, aggressive or too direct or anything like that. But passive language sounds like stepping or reaching, right? Verbs that have ing at the end rather than step or reach. And I do find that speaking in the present tense, it's a small change, but it really helps imply immediacy for our students, and it lets them know that we want them to take action right away. So that's a great thing to kind of audit yourself for and look for in your own language. The next thing to check for, again, especially when you are talking about the body, is are you making it personal or are you speaking in a way that sounds a little bit clinical, right? So are you saying the knee versus your knee? And again, it's just a very small shift that can help really make things more embodied for your students. So always, making it feel like it's about them because it is. And then the last piece to check for when you're auditing for clarity is, are you being specific about the direction? So students shouldn't have to guess where to go next. And is there any way that you can be more clear about where you want them to go? All right. So those are the first two steps. Record yourself, listen to it back, and then begin to audit for clarity using that verb, body part, direction formula. Okay. Next step is to audit for pace and for silence. So when you're listening back to that recording, check in and ask yourself, how am I delivering my cues? And does my pacing make sense for the type of class that I'm teaching? I think that it's important to recognize that depending on the type of class that we are teaching, the pace or like the delivery of our cues probably will need to change a little bit. So for example, if you're teaching a vinyasa class, like something that is a little bit more moderate or like faster pace, something a little bit stronger, like one breath, one movement, you are going to have to be a little bit snappier with your cues because you don't have that much time. And on the other side of things, if you are teaching a more restorative practice, for example, or something slower moving where your students are spending a lot longer in each shape, then you can deliver your cues in a slower way. You might have more time in each pose to speak to a little bit more detail. And then the other thing that's going to come into play, especially in those kinds of classes, is space for silence. So when you listen back to that recording of yourself teaching, check in and ask yourself, am I talking the entire class? Or do I consciously, purposely leave empty space where I'm not talking and where I'm not filling that space all the time? And even in a more active, more like athletic style practice, you can strategically use silence, especially closer to the end of practice, to really let people connect to their own experience so that it's not just your voice kind of filling their heads all the time. And I think that silence can be something that a lot of teachers struggle with. So that's definitely something, to look at and ask yourself about, like, am I talking because I have something really important to say? Or am I talking because I'm anxious or because I'm uncomfortable with silence while I'm teaching? So that's the next step. Checking for your pace. Does it make sense for the type of class that you're teaching? Checking for use of silence. And I'll just add that typically when we're delivering cues, we do need to deliver them a little bit slower than we think. And you probably need to leave just a little bit of space between each cue so that people have time to really listen and absorb what you're saying. The next step is to make note of your filler habits. And I think that this is probably the most unconscious part of our teaching, because most of the time when we have filler words that we use or verbal tics, we don't realize that we're doing them and we don't realize that they're happening while we're teaching. And it's not until we listen to ourselves back or until somebody else gives us feedback on this that we really notice what those things are. And that first step in, noticing what your filler habits are is just bringing awareness to them, right? Just noticing, oh my gosh, I say all the time, or I have this one particular verbal tic or phrase that I repeat constantly, and maybe it doesn't need to be there. And I think that once you start noticing what those filler words are, you can start reducing them little by little. They're probably always still going to be there, but over time we can refine just a little bit. Now, the last step is to check, and this is a little bit more nuanced, but to check if there is a balance in your teaching between clarity and agency in your cues. So, in order for our cues to be clear and to be easily understood, they do need to be direct. And that means that we have to get to the point without being overly invitational or overly fluffy. And I just, I want to acknowledge that there's kind of a fine line here, because in some communities or some, particular environments or circumstances, that very invitational language can definitely have a time and place, especially with more trauma-informed teaching, and that's important. But what I want you to know is that clarity is a gift, and clarity is a gift that we can offer our students. And again, being direct while still respecting people's agency and people's choice is what will help establish trust in the classroom. And when language becomes too vague or too invitational because we're afraid of sounding authoritative, it doesn't empower our students. It can actually leave them feeling confused and feeling bad about themselves because they don't know what you want them to do. So that's another piece to just look out for in your teaching is finding that balance between clarity but still communicating, that everybody has a choice in your classroom to do what is best for them at all times. And then one last little note that I'll add here is when you're going through and performing this small audit on your verbal cues is to start really small. So you don't need to overhaul your entire teaching and change everything immediately. I would start implementing really small changes. Just begin by bringing awareness to how your language is landing. Are there particular aspects of your language or verbal cues that you think could use a little bit of work? Are there certain types of poses or movements or transitions that you struggle to communicate, and then focus on those. So take it like one little piece at a time. And know that, as yoga teachers, like, we make an ongoing commitment to learning and refining. So refining your language is probably something that you are always going to be doing as a yoga teacher. And, it's like there isn't necessarily a final goal here. It's just something that we're always continually working on. So there's no finish line. And yeah, that's just what I want to say. So those are the steps. Record yourself teaching. Audit for clarity using the verb plus body part plus direction framework. Check your pacing and use silence intentionally. Notice if you are using filler words or if you have particular, verbal tics that come up all the time. And then check in, are you balancing clarity with agency? Okay? So if this episode resonates with you, if you implemented any of these tips, let me know. I would love for you to rate and subscribe to Yoga Insider Podcast wherever you're listening. And I can't wait to see you next time. Thank you for being here.